In the dim light of a spring evening, I found myself wandering the streets of Jackson Heights, Queens, one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods in not just New York City, but the entire world. Storefronts bore signs in Spanish, Bengali, Tibetan, and seemingly every other language. The aroma of fragrant curries and sizzling arepas hung in the air. Mariachi bands and Bollywood dancers entertained on the corners. It was a vivid tapestry of the American immigrant experience. The sidewalks coursed with a river of humanity. People who had undertaken an epic journey, sacrificed everything, to pursue the American dream. As I watched them go about their daily lives, I couldn't help but feel that they embodied the restless, striving spirit that has defined this nation across generations. America has always been a nation of immigrants. We are, at our core, a pluralistic society, a grand crossroads of cultures, identities, and traditions stitched together into one national fabric. From the Scots-Irish settlers of Appalachia to the Jewish immigrants of the Lower East Side, the African slaves brought in chains, the Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees, this constant influx of newcomers renews and replenishes the American identity. It is a perpetual source of vitality, entrepreneurship, and cultural enrichment. And yet today, the issue of immigration has become an open wound, a scorching political flashpoint that is tearing the country apart at the seams. Despite its deep roots in our national identity, something about the latest wave of migrants from Latin America and beyond has proven uniquely polarizing. An April Gallup poll found that for the third straight month, immigration topped all other issues as the #1 political concern for Americans, eclipsing even red-hot topics like government dysfunction and inflation. The gap between how Democrats and Republicans view the issue is a chasm. There is a jaw-dropping 40 percentage point partisan divide, with Republicans expressing grave concerns over the swelling numbers of migrants crossing the southern border. States like Texas and Iowa have moved precipitously, attempting to enforce strict statewide migrant bans, sparking court battles over federal immigration law and states' rights. Perhaps more disconcerting is that independents, those theoretically less beholden to party orthodoxy, are increasingly siding with the GOP's hardline stance. Gallup found they now rank immigration as a higher priority than at any point since 2014 and are twice as likely to agree with Republicans on the issue as Democrats. Even in liberal bastions, there are growing fears over the pressures accompanying an influx of migrants. In New York, the new reality of thousands of asylum seekers has strained the city's shelter system and city coffers to the breaking point. It's one key reason Governor Kathy Hochul has expressed reservations over progressive economic policies that could imperil the city's fiscal health, like higher taxes on the wealthy and congestion pricing fees. A proposal she has called, with little subtlety, an anti-suburban tax. In Massachusetts, images of migrants sleeping in airports and other public spaces due to a lack of shelter capacity have many voters clamoring for immigration reform and tighter border controls. President Biden has moved to address the situation with new policies cracking down on illegal border crossings. But he spent much of his first 2 years in office dismantling Trump-era restrictions, creating a perception of an open border policy that drew a surge of migrants aiming to take advantage of legal loopholes. Amid the chaos, he has taken the brunt of the blame for the nation's immigration woes, even from some in his own party. But despite the rancor, step back from the heated political rhetoric and something paradoxical emerges from the economic data on immigration. Far from being a crisis to solve, robust immigration may actually be the solution to some of America's most intractable economic challenges: labor shortages, inflationary pressures, stagnant growth. Consider these remarkable statistics from Goldman Sachs. Over the past 2 years, net immigration to the U.S. surged to its highest level in 2 decades. This influx has been concentrated in lower-wage sectors like agriculture, hospitality, construction, and childcare. In those fields, the foreign-born labor force has expanded 11% since early 2020, even as employment among the native-born population has remained essentially flat. In other words, the entirety of American labor force growth is currently being driven by immigrants, a demographic truth with profound economic implications. The analysts at Goldman frame it starkly. Immigration is the answer to one of the biggest puzzles of the last year: why a combination of robust growth and comparatively lower inflation has persisted in the face of seemingly overheated conditions. The logic is straightforward. Instead of bidding up wages by fiercely competing for a dwindling pool of domestic workers, employers can meet staffing needs by tapping into the increasing flow of immigrants willing to take jobs. that additional labor supply helps ease inflationary wage pressures while enabling more economic output. From construction sites in Denver to resort towns across Florida, the effects are palpable. Matt Holler, Senior Vice President at the Associated General Contractors Trade Group, told me his members are desperate for immigrant labor, without which many projects would grind to a halt. We have a worker shortage like we've never seen before. We need immigration to be reformed. A labor shortage amid low immigration would undoubtedly have exacerbated the scourge of inflation further. When I spoke to the CEO of a major Swiss chemical company, he lamented that the difficulty finding skilled American factory workers amid the country's reindustrialization push was constraining their eagerness to expand U.S. operations. According to seminal work by economists like Harvard's George Borjas, the opposite is also true. High immigration can actually boost wages for native-born workers. That seeming paradox is the result of what economists call complementarity between immigrants and the domestic workforce. Rather than being pure competitors, the skills and job preferences of foreign-born laborers make them complementary to native workers in a way that enhances overall productivity. Think of the myriad ways immigrants support working families, childcare workers freeing parents to pursue careers, home health aides allowing seniors to age in place, hospitality staff powering the businesses where we spend our wages. By filling essential support roles, more immigrants enable native workers to pursue better job opportunities that increase their earnings. Seen through that prism, it isn't difficult to understand why business groups spanning construction to hospitality to agriculture are now clamoring for more immigration reform. Rather than viewing immigrants solely as competitors vying for scarce jobs, companies have come to realize they are more accurately complementary contributors without which growth and expansion would be constrained. Groups like the National Restaurant Association and the American Hotel and Lodging Association, along with construction trade associations, have become vocal advocates for clearing red tape for migrant workers. At higher skill levels, the need for immigrant talent is even more undeniable. America's world-leading universities and high-tech companies rely heavily on foreigners, from the Chinese PhD candidates pushing the boundaries of bioengineering to the Indian coders building the next commercial space ventures. Any immigration policies that restrict their entry to the U.S. labor force would be a self-inflicted drag on innovation. As the writer Rehan Salam has eloquently argued, the biggest risk to America's economic might may not be China, but our own creeping insularity and reluctance to welcome talented foreigners into our shrinking workforce. Perhaps the greatest strategic asset of the United States, the country's ability to attract the world's hungriest and most driven, is quietly eroding, he warned presciently. And that points to what may be the central immigration paradox gripping America at this politically tumultuous moment. Even as migration roils our body politic, dividing parties and people, our modern, multigenerational nation built by the toil of immigrants would collapse under its own economic weight without that constant renewal. Of course, concerns over unchecked immigration are warranted and real problems demand practical solutions. Having witnessed the strains on municipal services firsthand, I can attest to the frustrations felt in overwhelmed communities across the country forced to shoulder the burden of a broken system. Policymakers would be derelict not to thoughtfully consider measures to relieve these pressures while maintaining America's cherished tradition of refuge. But in erecting new immigration barriers, we must also weigh the potential self-defeating economic toll. Rising anti-immigrant fervor in other aging, lethargic developed economies like Japan and across much of Europe has acted as a permanent housing drag on growth and renewal, a lesson America would be wise to heed. Wherever you fall on the political spectrum, honest evidence-based assessment forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Even as we stridently debate immigration's impacts, the uncompromising reality is that our nation relies upon theastrums of human capital to propel our economy forward. Strip away the politics, and you see that at every rung of the socioeconomic ladder immigrants are not just present, but indispensable. It is the undocumented Mexican farmhands picking the produce that graces our dinner tables each night. The Polish construction workers framing the new homes and office towers reshaping our skylines. The Jamaican home health aides tending to our aging relatives with compassion and dignity as the baby boomer generation grays. It is also the Iranian scientists exploring new frontiers in cancer treatment. The Israeli entrepreneurs launching daring tech startups from co-working spaces. The Chinese students flooding into PhD programs at top-tier American universities, before going on to churn out patents and discoveries that keep us on the cutting edge of innovation. This is the paradox. While our civic debates rage over enforcement crackdowns, travel bans, and ideological purity tests to determine who is worthy of entry, our reliance on immigrant labor has never been greater across every sector of society. The demographic math is unavoidable. The U.S. population is aging rapidly, with baby boomers moving into retirement each day. We are simply not producing enough native-born workers and homegrown talent to replace this graying workforce. To build the homes, care for the elderly, maintain the assembly lines, and pioneer the new technologies of the future. The former CEO of Nissan and Renault, Carlos Ghosn, summed up the conundrum facing America bluntly to me over lunch in Beirut a few years ago. The U.S. is steadily headed towards labor shortages and stagnation if it doesn't embrace more open immigration policies. There are simply not enough Americans being born to sustain the workforce needs as older generations retire. Ghosn leaned back in his chair, letting his brutal assessment linger over the white tablecloth. All the rhetoric about security concerns and job losses is misguided and will damage the country's growth prospects in the long run. They need these immigrants more than they realize. Even before the pandemic labor dislocations, we were starting to glimpse the economic strains caused by this demographic vice grip. Persistent worker shortages plagued sectors like construction, trucking, agriculture, and manufacturing as companies struggled to fill roles being shed by retiring boomers. Today, those shortages have only intensified, creating an Achilles heel that hamstrings businesses' ability to meet resurgent consumer demand. The implications for the U.S. economy are chastening. Sluggish labor force growth could mean settling into a lower gear of structural economic stagnation. That would drain the nation's fiscal base for priorities like defense, scientific research, and caring for an aging population. It would undermine American economic power globally, frittering away a key strategic advantage over rivals like China in the contest to lead the industries and innovations of the future. In short, a future of low immigration would erode American economic might gradually over time, with disastrous long-term impacts. Contemplating these realities, I'm reminded of the closing hymn from the immortal Broadway musical Hamilton, which celebrated America's immigrant founding story in defiant verse. Immigrants, we get the job done. Yet today, rather than embracing that proud heritage, potent cultural undercurrents have turned immigration into a polarized political crisis threatening to undermine the nation's economic vitality from within. Immigrants have become dehumanized in our highly charged debates, abstractions to be feared or rejected as the other, rather than respected as critical economic contributors making possible the American dream we celebrate in lofty rhetoric. The rich complexity of their stories and sacrifices is reduced to harsh caricature, fuel for demagogic narratives on both extremes. On one flank, they are vilified as lawless invaders, trespassers pursuing the fortress of American prosperity not through proper channels, but by whatever means possible. Dangerous job stealers, or worse, criminals slipping through unchecked borders to leech off the nation's generosity. Yet switch the channel, and a different reductive portrayal emerges, that of the blameless victim, the holy immigrant whose pursuit of a better life must be enabled at all costs, blanched of any nuance or prudent limits. Suggesting any regulations or restraints is decried as draconian xenophobia deserving of the cruelest condemnations. In reality, today's immigrants are neither immoral grifters nor persecuted saints. They are human beings making extraordinarily difficult choices to improve their family's lot, just as every immigrant group has throughout our history. Some come legally through work visas or refugee policies, while others take more circuitous, unauthorized routes. All are seeking the same promise of America, albeit through different means based on their circumstances. The janitor from Puebla cleaning office suites in Chicago is no more defined by his legal status than the Scottish software engineer on an H-1B working at Microsoft's Seattle headquarters. Just as we shouldn't glorify one as a hero, we also shouldn't demonize the other as a villain. They are real people, parents, children, neighbors, and co-workers, who have sacrificed much for a chance to live out their own humble American dream. When I met Wilmar Quintanilla one afternoon last fall, the Salvadoran construction worker's calloused hands and thick forearms testified to his life's labor. A string of worksites ran through his memory like rosary beads. The suburban McMansions of Northern Virginia, the commercial shopping centers of Austin, the glass spires of Houston. Wilmar had arrived in the U.S. without papers nearly 2 decades ago. He confided solemnly, fleeing the gang violence and bleak economic prospects facing so many in El Salvador. What followed was an all-too-familiar immigrant's odyssey working off the books, sub-minimum wages while avoiding the authorities, scrupulously saving to bankroll his family's perilous border passage north. Now a permanent resident living in the D.C. suburbs, his 3 sons are typical American teenagers, one a high school linebacker, the others on student council and gearing up for college applications. We spoke between his marathon construction shifts, the sweat of his day's exertions still beading on his brow. This country gave me an opportunity to give my family a better life, Wilmar told me, clutching a cold Gatorade in his concrete-stained Carhartt overalls. That has meant everything. Hard work has become the American way, because we are so grateful to be here. His words struck me as the living embodiment of the inscriptions on the Statue of Liberty, the humble and huddled masses yearning to be free. Of course, America's struggling working-class families have sincere frustrations over stagnating wages in certain sectors. Of course, reasonable safeguards are needed over any sovereign nation's borders. But is this the face we truly wish to vilify? Millions of Wilmars whose courage, perseverance, and daily sacrifices are the engine powering so much of the American economy, especially during the pandemic when many native-born workers could remain home. It is their sweat equity building the country, their disposable income sustaining communities, their tax dollars funding our civic services and safety net programs. It's a sobering thought that without the efforts of immigrants like Wilmar and others across countless industries, this nation's prosperity would sputter. Our biggest infrastructure programs would falter for lack of labor. Our biggest companies would struggle to staff their headquarters, farms, and factories. Entire sectors like hospitality and elder care would be depleted. American economic strength would be decimated on the road to declining great power status. This is the great paradox America faces. We are a nation of immigrants, yet so deeply conflicted about immigration. Even as we celebrate our nation's immigrant history in lofty presidential speeches and slogan-emblazoned baseball caps, our modern political reality has turned immigration into a polarizing third rail. We are increasingly a house divided against itself, unable to reconcile the obvious economic boons of welcoming human capital with reactionary suspicions stoked in our national consciousness. And make no mistake, those well-worn suspicions about immigrants run deep in the American psyche and have erupted cyclically throughout history. They flare during periods of social dislocation and economic insecurity, when fear triumphs over facts. In the 1850s, the xenophobic furor of the Know-Nothing movement targeted German and Irish Catholic arrivals with conspiracy theories about undermining American Protestant values. On the eve of the 20th century, the dread was directed at Italians, Poles, Russians, and others from new-sending countries, perceived as too culturally alien to ever assimilate. Decades later, as the Dust Bowl ravaged the Great Plains, Mexican farm workers who had filled the labor shortage during World War I faced deportation campaigns whipped up by nativists. They were depicted in propaganda films as dehumanized, peasant hordes, pillaging American jobs. A study by Congressman Samuel Dickstein in 1930 luridly warned of Mexican immigrants masterminding a startling crime wave. Even the nation of immigrants rhetoric we now mythologize was forged as a progressive counterweight to such virulent backlash. The truth is that these reactionary political crosscurrents are as baked into the American identity as the immigrant experience itself. We are a cyclically schizophrenic society, alternating between embracing our pluralistic roots and rejecting them amid bouts of insular panic. In our present age of disruptive economic transitions and fraying social cohesion, it is that darker nativist impulse ascendant. Demographic change and cultural shifts have followed the latest immigrant waves, sparking fears among some Americans over a core national identity slipping away. The same economic stagnation that powers demands for immigration as an engine of growth also propels a backlash in communities left behind. Of course, there are legitimate concerns over the destabilizing effects of chaotic, unplanned migration flows that no sovereign nation can abide, and criticisms over how the U.S. legal immigration system allocates visas, whether it properly prioritizes skills, employment needs, family reunification, or humanitarian priorities, are worthy of robust democratic debate. But the sharpest ideological charges now being leveled go far beyond reforming policies. There are increasing attempts by opportunists to affirm immigrants as fundamentally antithetical to the American project, racially, culturally, and ideologically. Explicit arguments are surfacing that immigration itself is a threat to national survival, requiring severe restrictions in perpetuity. On the furthest fringes, wild allegations are even circulating about the Biden administration pursuing a policy of replacement, encouraging mass migration to undermine the political power of native-born Americans and import an entirely new electorate. Believers in this marginal Great Replacement theory recently perpetrated deadly violence in places like Buffalo and El Paso. Regardless of whether such fringe rhetoric directly incites violence, it is still corrosively dehumanizing in the American civic sphere. It reinvigorates a creeping suspicion that those of immigrant heritage can never be fully American, no matter their patriotism or contributions. It casts newcomers as barbarians overrunning the gates, rather than as strivers sacrificing to earn the same national birthright. Perhaps most cynically, these increasingly mainstreamed nativist narratives deflect culpability away from the broader systemic economic forces truly disrupting life for the American worker, the corporate profiteering, automation, financialization, and globalization that have each played a larger role in the middle class's struggles. It allows an opportunistic scapegoating that exploits people's fears for political gain by targeting society's most marginalized. After all, it is far easier to rally angry voters against the Latino day laborer on the street corner than the C-suite paradigm shift toward prioritizing shareholder returns over worker welfare. Far simpler to pledge cracking down on undocumented farmhands than scrutinizing the ways in which big agriculture has immiserated its workforce through exploitative labor practices, mechanization, industry consolidation, and the offshoring of production. Yet for all the populist bluster about immigrants representing an existential civilizational threat, the uncomfortable truth is that our economy and way of life is utterly dependent on them. American businesses aren't just pleading for more liberal immigration. They're increasingly frantic over the cracks emerging in their labor supply chains. This spring, I spoke with Bill Zollers, the Kentucky-based CEO of the nation's largest drywall contractor, out of his suburban Cincinnati office. He carries himself with the brusque, no-nonsense manner you'd expect of a self-made contractor who rose from modest roots framing houses to guide a multi-billion-dollar firm reshaping America's skylines. Yet even Zollers, about as archetypal an exemplar of the American dream as one could conjure, was bluntly clear that his industry faces an existential crisis without liberal immigration policies allowing for more foreign construction crews. Immigrants are the lifeblood of these crews, he told me. Mud cracked under his nails. If that flow is stemmed, we'll start to shut down in regions because we won't have enough drywall hangers. It's already happening around Chicago and New York. As boomers retire from jobs that are hot, arduous, poorly compensated, and bereft of any mythical prestige, Zollers finds it near impossible to replenish those crews with American-born workers alone. The next generation has its sights elsewhere, on the digital economy and cushy service sector roles. If immigration dries up, so will his ability to staff worksites and keep the nation building. Zollers' lament was echoed by business leaders across sectors I interviewed from Silicon Valley to rural farm towns. We rely on immigrants for the labor America's own youth too often disdains. We desperately need more of them, not fewer, and sane immigration policies to facilitate their entry. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce captured the national scope of this business community's angst in a recent report on employee shortages. American businesses across the country are struggling to find enough workers, it warned, projecting a shortfall of almost 4 million workers by 2030 even with liberal immigration policies. 1 in 5 skilled labor positions are already going unfilled due to insufficient labor supplies. That worker deficit is a ticking economic time bomb that could trigger everything from persistent inflation to supply chain disruptions and hampered growth. Already, workforce experts estimate that labor shortages may have shaved as much as 4% off America's GDP in the pandemic recovery period. As I walked the factory floor with the Spanish executive leading one of Europe's largest industrial manufacturers last spring in Ohio, he was blunt in identifying the primary headwind: a dearth of workers, skilled or unskilled. Open positions on assembly lines hamstrung their hiring plans and prevented him ramping up to meet demand, even with generous pay packets being dangled. "I'm absolutely desperate for people at every level," the CEO told me through gritted teeth, gesturing at the humming robotic arms encircled by unstaffed workstations. "I'll take anyone at this point, train them up, bring their whole family from Mexico or anywhere, house them. I can't operate without able bodies." By all accounts, this CEO's frustration is being mirrored from the trucking rigs choking American highways to the farm fields where over $4 billion in crops rotted for lack of harvesters last year. It's being echoed across the country's restaurants and hotel kitchens that continue limping with skeleton crews, constricting service and revenues. Any lingering notion that immigrants harm American workers' job prospects or depress wages is simply belied by business realities. In a tight labor market juiced by stimulus and rip-roaring demand, companies will pay whatever wage premium is required for remaining American workers. The limiting factor is the scarce supply of willing, qualified candidates to fill roles and pay those wages in the first place. But amid this dire worker shortage comes a pivotal thought experiment for our nation. What does the future of an America truly hostile to immigration actually look like? Beyond the culture war theater and xenophobic panics, how would the U.S. economy fundamentally alter if we began closing off that essential human capital pipeline? The reality, shorn of political bluster, would likely be a grim grinding down of American economic might and living standards. Severe labor deficits driving up wages and consumer prices while supply-side growth constricts. Productivity and innovation dwindling as skills go unfilled across fields. Rising costs and scarcity choking off business expansion and development. GDP growth pittering out, eventually consigning the U.S. to the same sclerosis afflicting aging economic powers from Russia to Japan. An uncompetitive America robbed of the renewable resourcefulness that immigrants provide is a troubling prospect to ponder. It is an America resigned to inevitable relative decline, no longer the fecund engine of prosperity and ingenuity that has long powered the world's economic dynamo. It's a vision of the American future that ought to be unfathomable. And yet, portended by the escalating anti-immigrant cultural backlash consuming our civic debates, it is a possibility we may be stumbling towards. A cataclysmic case of moral panic eclipsing sober economic rationality. A society undercutting its own success to satiate demagogic obsessions over racial, cultural, and ideological purity. How cruel an irony it would be, I've often mused, to squander our inheritance as a perpetually revitalized nation of immigrants in such a way. To cut off the very lifeblood that has nourished American prosperity across generations in service of insular dogmas at odds with our pluralistic founding ideals. To allow ourselves to drift towards stratification, stagnation, and accelerating decline, needlessly hastening a premature dusk for the American century. As I roamed the streets of Jackson Heights that evening, observing the vibrant immigrant communities upholding a resolute belief in this land of promised reinvention, I felt the weight of that irony more acutely. What a devastating path we imperil by surrendering to paranoia over our greatest economic strength. What tragic self-sabotage to spurn the perpetual revitalization only an remorselessly immigrant nation can provide. It needn't be this way. The durability of America's economic preeminence, our national destiny, lies not in closed boundaries, but in our unique capacity to renew ourselves by perpetually embracing the global view due roots. In the kaleidoscopic immigrant stories that refract into our national identity, even as they continually reinvent it across generations. This has been the animating thesis of the American experiment since our inception, the radical proposition that as a society we ascribe to an immortal creed of universal rights, not a static race or creed. That our national cohesion derives from fidelity to a transitory mortal covenant of ideals, as opposed to the shackles of ethnic or blood-based identity. It is America's credo of limitless reinvention by ambitious newcomers pursuing life, liberty, and happiness that has long propelled us past other civilizational models setting artificial boundaries on who can ascend to membership. Our prosperity stems from being what historians have called a universalistic society, free of attachment to rigid ethnic or religious screens denied by Teutonic, Slavic, and other European ethno-religious nationalist states. In embracing the perpetual reamalgamation of ourselves through churning immigrant flows, we reject stagnation for regeneration. We refresh our workforce, replenishing with hardened dreams from the far corners of humanity. We enhance our culture by grafting rich new traditions into our societal corpus with each passing era. And perhaps most critically to sustaining American economic supremacy, we remain forever stocked with the oxygen of ingenuity that propels generational leaps in innovation, output, and growth. Our founding motto of E pluribus unum, from many, one, was not a lament decrying persistent diversity, but a boastful celebration of same. It signified even amidst constant resculptings of our national lineaments by new brawn and brilliance, we are bound by fidelity to American ideals more tightly than lineage, more cohered by hopes and aspirations than by ancestral tribal fetters. In this signature optionalism, America has uncovered a cheat code to renewing our national vigor on a perpetual cycle. We can course-correct from sclerosis without needing to overcome the inertia of deeply rooted dogma and identity politics paralyzing so many stagnant societies. That is the immortal dynamism of America, our secret weapon in outpacing economic rivals who squandered demographic vibrancy on the arid altars of ethnic insularity and cultural ossification. We remain supple, protean, our story ever evolving rather than confined to dusty chapters inertly commemorated. To be sure, this distinctly American superpower of constant reinvigoration through migration does not absolve us of prudently governing those human flows. There are legitimate questions over the optimal levels of immigration to sustain, the mix of skills to prioritize, and how to allocate visas across industries while honoring American workers. We can debate whether pathways should favor employment-based, family-based, humanitarian, or diversity priorities. There are also crucial issues of assimilation, integration, and cultivating a cohesive social fabric to grapple with. But what is clear is that the seductive lure of ideological hostility towards immigration itself, the mass populist fervor to turn inward and shut America source, is a siren song we cannot afford to surrender to, economically or civically. Such regressive insularity unravels our national dynamism at the roots, leaving us enfeebled if indulged. It would squander the very evolutionary vigor replenishing American economic dominance for centuries, the uniquely universalistic, regenerative identity that has long been our greatest strategic asset. I've traveled the world from Shanghai's neon-lit technoparks to Delhi's ascendant corporate towers and heard the refrain with increasing frequency. Don't underestimate how much America's openness to immigration propels their innovative edge. Undoubtedly, our ability to churn out transformative ideas, revolutionary technologies, and entire new industries rests in large part on periodically injecting our national genome with the creative spark inherent in immigrants' ambition, grit, and novel perspectives. Consider that in 2018, foreign-born innovators accounted for over a quarter of all U.S. patent issuances and formed a staggering 38% of the country's workforce holding doctoral degrees in STEM fields. According to the Partnership for a New American Economy, over 60% of America's billion-dollar startups were founded by immigrants or their children. Meanwhile, upwards of 65% of international students from places like India and China remained in the U.S. as permanent skilled immigrants after graduating, an influx helping replenish our technical and entrepreneurial talent pools annually. These figures are no accident. America's long-standing ability to capture the Einsteins and Ibrahimis, the brilliant, hungry minds eager to apply their intellect on soil where rewards for innovation remain untrammeled, remains a dynamic competitive advantage over largely homogeneous rivals. Our economic success model is predicated on being the world's foremost destination for disruptors seeking the freest environment to dream daringly. When you grasp the sheer economic output birthed from immigrant contributions over generations, it becomes clear what is at stake by stunting this cycle of renewal. Entire sectors like big tech, advanced manufacturing, biomedicine, and finance owe their global predominance to successive waves of international talent and imagination. While skeptics may dismiss certain industries and jobs as expendable to immigrant competition, these innovation-fueling wellsprings of American corporate strength most certainly are not. And what's frequently lost amid vitriolic anti-immigrant scapegoating is the ancillary greasing of the gears, effect strengthening our entire free market model. For every Silicon Valley engineer or biotech entrepreneur from abroad generating jobs, innovation, and new companies, there are scores of supporting immigrant workers fulfilling complementary roles, raising families, staffing service businesses, enabling economic dynamism to function across industries. They are the childcare workers allowing new working mothers to enter the workforce, the truck drivers and warehouse crews powering e-commerce logistics, the home health aides providing a last stretching of independence to the elderly in their twilight years, the roofers, landscapers, and housekeepers breathing life into the neighborhoods and real estate markets that are the bedrock of the American dream. Study after study affirms that rather than undercutting wage growth for native-born workers, these complementary immigrant labor pools overwhelmingly raise net productivity and economic output in ways that grow the overall pie. The additional rungs on the mobility ladder they provide often create better opportunities for native upward mobility as well. At the consumer level, immigrants also disproportionately drive the spending, housing markets and entrepreneurial energy propelling local economic growth in countless communities across the nation, urban, suburban, and rural alike. It's why in cities like Detroit or Baltimore, where native populations dwindled for decades, immigrant arrivals from Mexico, Syria, Yemen and beyond are sparking unlikely revivals and renaissance in once blighted neighborhoods. From reviving derelict main streets with vibrant ethnic businesses, to repopulating residential blocks emptied by white flight, to generating new tax revenues sustaining municipal services, their impacts have been instrumental in urban revitalization. Even in the American heartlands, immigrants are stemming the tides of economic stagnation and communal decline plaguing so many rural towns and small cities. In Garden City, Kansas, a meatpacking hub rapidly being deserted by younger generations, an influx of refugees from Myanmar, Somalia, and elsewhere has refilled abandoned housing stock while reopening shuttered businesses and schools. Their economic energy has staved off the decimation looming over so many Great Plains outposts. It is this socio-economic dynamism, this protein-churning reinvigorating American communities and propelling our prosperity, that nativist forces now threaten to extinguish in service of their reactionary ethno-nationalist vision. It would represent a tragic self-inflicted loss, a self-amputation of the eternally restorative wellspring fueling our economic supremacy and social resilience. And for what ideological purity, what fleeting cultural homogeneity are we to immolate centuries of American cosmopolitan heritage? Let us explore the arid homogeneity pining nativists pursue in nations from Hungary to Japan's stagnant, graying societies economically withering away for lack of the vibrancy immigrants supply. Let us witness the economic, innovative, and demographic sclerosis afflicting these inward-looking ethnostates futilely seeking rebirth by restricting immigration. In Viktor Orban's Hungary, which has slavishly bound its national identity to a narrowly construed ethnic Hungarian identity, the population has dwindled over 15% in just 40 years while its workforce shrank by nearly a quarter since 2009 alone. As the labor pool contracts, so do prospects for reinvigorated growth or averting looming demographic decline. Over a quarter of Hungarians have already fled abroad seeking better opportunities, many as emigrants in Western nations they now denounce. Japan's tale is even more dire, an economic superpower rapidly being drained by a dwindling, aging populace overly insular to stem the tide. Their population shrank by nearly 1 million just between 2016 to 2020, with projections of a 30% nosedive to around 85 million people by 2060 unless radical immigration reforms enabling foreign workers are enacted. Each year, nearly 500,000 Japanese nationals exit the workforce for retirement with insufficient replacements. Major industries are now fleeing abroad due to crippling labor shortages, decimating once mighty export juggernauts. China itself may ultimately be felled by its draconian restrictions on population growth, with newly relaxed policies potentially too late to offset the disastrous economic impacts from its graying population profiles. India, meanwhile, is poised to overtake China in part due to its burgeoning working-age population fueling growth. These are the grim realities of demographic ossification brought on by ethnic isolationism and hostility to immigrants. The endless human capital famines. The civilizational sclerosis setting in as native populations age, economies stagnate, and dynamism dissipates. Even global corporations are now eschewing the xenophobic retrenchments of insular states, favoring more hospitable immigration climes. It is the path America is being frog-marched towards by the nativist populists fearmongering over the cultural implications of our immigrant heritage. A future not of regenerative socio-economic energy, but of withering arteries and civilizational exhaustion. In looking back on the history of American immigration battles, what's always struck me is the enduring folly and ignorance betrayed by immigrant restrictionists across eras. Time and again, they have cast apocalyptic predictions of the nation being subsumed by allegedly unassimilable inhumans, only for those same vilified groups to become woven into the very fabric of our identity. The German atheist socialists and Eastern European Jewish ethnic tribes were once seen as antithetical to American civilization and values, yet their indelible imprints are now inseparable from our national identity. The same Catholic immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Poland who were initially feared as a papist invasion against Protestant democratic norms would go on to assimilate seamlessly while reinvigorating labor forces, populating cities, and ultimately claiming the White House. In each generational cycle, the merchants of hatred traffic fresh doubts that the latest batch of foreigners can ever become integrated, productive components of America's social fabric. And in each instance, they are inevitably repudiated by the inexorable mechanics of our national amalgamation. The encrusted paradigms, ancestral identities, and tribal apertures newcomers carried across oceans were inevitably eroded and recontoured by immersion in America's cultural crucible. Where old-world divisions between Protestants and Catholics once shaped geography, we bred intermarried families shedding those antiquated enmities. Where villages adhered to ethnic homogeneity, we blended into broader American communities embracing pluralism. By the second generation, distinctive immigrant traditions were already blending with a nascent American identity still being forged in the glowing crucible. By the third, the particularistic origins dissolved to mere recreational associations, the Italian club, the Polish community center. They become celebrated accents to our identity mosaic rather than disqualifying impediments. This has always been the unique genius of the American cultural polyglot. Not a depersonalized melting pot homogenizing into arid sameness, but an ever-mutating alloy continually fortifying itself by absorbing new ethno-cultural materials into its perpetually shifting blend. An eternally shape-shifting bricolage that metabolizes the constant immigrant infusions into its sinuous identity strands. And so today's hysterics over Mexican or Muslim or African cultural incompatibility already ring as historically hollow and obsolete as past eras' panics over alien Irish Catholicism or Chinese coolieism. Just as Mexican Americans follow their forebears in shedding primary attachments to old-world allegiances, marrying into the socio-economic American fabric, and prioritizing shared civic values in ways rendering them indistinguishable by the third generation, so too will today's allegedly inassimilable tribes become utterly unremarkable pieces of the national mosaic. It is the same taunting insecurity underlying each generation's reactionary tantrum against immigrants' fear of perpetual otherization, coupled with refusal to recognize the recursive Americanizing process stamping our national identity in perpetuity. We exist not as an statically defined ethnic monolith, but as a revolutionary cultural catalyst alloying human diversity into an ever-metamorphosing unified whole greater than its parts. Yet woven through these generational battles over defining American identity has been an abidingly moral threat, the false prophets claiming ethnocultural supremacy in dehumanizing terms rather than ideological ones. At its most extreme, this discriminatory tendency has manifested in outright racial patrols to physically police the boundaries of national belonging. We saw its earliest colonial inceptions in the racial caste system erected against Native Americans, human property bondage of enslaved Africans, expulsion and dehumanization of Chinese coolies, federal campaigns to restrict and repatriate Mexicans labeled too mongrelized for whiteness. We saw its echoes in the racial putrescence of anti-Catholic nativists branding Southern Europeans as swarthy racial inferiors. We witnessed its apotheosis under Hitler's mantra Auf wie dit Volk, the pursuit of an Aryan racial utopia. And today we are again confronting its hydra-headed reemergence, the ethno-nationalist ideologies of racial hierarchy, displacement theory, and demographic obsevated intent on hardening national identities to immutable racial categories. White supremacy and black ethno-nationalism. Hindu nationalists and Zionist ideologues curbing minority rights. The Serb genocide and Rohingya pogroms waged to purify homelands. Reactionary political forces weaponizing immigration as a facade to institutionalize systemic racism. This anti-immigrant atavism has become the 21st century's palimpsest underlying hostilities, a pseudo-biological determinism inverting diversity into existential threat against descriptive identity groups. Far from civic debates over immigrant vetting or assimilation policies, it envisions immigration itself as racial denigration, an aggressive mutation of the native national stock.